Hello everyone. So for this lecture video, we're going to go over the second part of our contracts overview, and this will be the lecture video for class 7. So in this class, we'll look again at the 4 formation elements for a contract, and then we'll go deeper into the second, third, and fourth elements. So in our previous class, we went over the first element of mutual assent, and for this class, we'll go over the second element of consideration. We'll look at items not sufficient for consideration. We'll look at substitutes for consideration. Then we'll look at the third and fourth elements for formation, which are capacity and legality. Finally, we'll touch on the topic of the statute of frauds, which is not part of the 4 formation elements, but are something that needs to be understood when considering whether a contract is either legal, void, or voidable. So, as you remember, a contract is formed from mutual assent, consideration, capacity, and legality, and a writing is not required to form a contract in all instances. A contract may be oral, as long as the 4 elements are there. Last class, we went over mutual assent, and this class will be going over consideration, capacity, and legality. So what is consideration? So consideration is when something of value is given in a bargain for exchange between both parties. So what is something of value? So something of value is a promise, act, or a forbearance to do or not do something that the parties agree to as part of their agreement. So let's see this example. Amanda tells Bob that she will provide him lodging in September if he agrees to pay her $200. Amanda's consideration is the promise of an obligatory future action. Bob's consideration is the act of paying $200. Both parties have provided consideration that was not legally required of them before the contract was created. So maybe the definition could be confusing at first glance, but consideration is actually something pretty easy to understand. Essentially, if somebody promises to do something in the future or promises to not do something, then that would satisfy consideration. When we say legal detriment, we really just mean that the parties are going to do something or promise to do something that they were not legally required to do. So the contract is imparting obligation through these promises that has no legal mandatory obligation. It's a voluntary private obligation. So in this case, Amanda has consideration because she promises Bob that he can live at her house or lodging in September. So that is she is not legally obligated to provide him lodging in September. She's promising that she will if he promises to give her something. So Bob has consideration here because he promises to pay her $200. He is not legally required to pay her $200. There's no court order. There's nothing here. So that is just a simple way to think about consideration. It's a promise, act, or a promise not to act as part of an agreement. So the elements are, it has to be legally sufficient and there has to be consideration on both sides. We call this a bargain for exchange. So let's go into each of these elements of consideration in more detail. So legal sufficiency. So a consideration is legally sufficient to render a promise enforceable if the promise 1. Incurs a legal detriment, or 2. The promisor receives a legal benefit. So in order to think about this, is legal detriment is what I said before, is in the previous example, Amanda is not obligated through a law or legally to actually allow Bob to stay in her lodging in September. But because she promised she will allow him, she is incurring a legal detriment. She's doing something that she's not legally obligated to do. Same way with Bob. Bob promised Amanda that he would pay her $200 in return for staying at her lodging in September. He is also doing something that he is legally not obligated to do, which is pay her $200. So just think of it like that. It's just a promise to do something that they legally are not obligated to do. So when you think of it that way, almost any legal detriment is sufficient. And the parity of value is not required between the two sides of the consideration coin. It's like if perhaps Bob staying at Amanda's house is not worth $200, perhaps it's worth $10,000. It doesn't matter. As long as there's a legal detriment on both sides, then this is legally sufficient. So this would be the Amanda and Bob example would be an example of a bilateral contract where there's one promise on one side made in exchange for another promise on the other side. So even if there's not a simultaneous exchange, and not even in regard to the form of what this consideration means, it will be legally sufficient as long as a legal detriment exists on both sides. So the second element of consideration is a bargain for exchange. That is when one party makes a promise or performance in exchange for a return promise or performance. So pretty simple, and it essentially is a repeat of the first part. Is that the first part of legal sufficiency means each of the promises on both sides has to be a legal detriment. And then the second for consideration is there has to be both. There has to be, if it's two parties, both sides of that coin, both parties have to suffer the legal detriment in their promise or performance within the contract. So it just simply means that both sides have to suffer legal detriment in the promise that they promise each other, and these two have to be exchanged for each other. So that's why the Amanda and Bob example is a cookie cutter example of when consideration is valid. So what are items that are not sufficient consideration? So these would be past consideration. The law deems that past consideration cannot be bargained for because such acts may have already happened, and the acting party can't actually promise to do something that already happened. So let's say this example. Father says to his daughter, "If you graduate, I promise to pay you $10,000 at the end of next month." If daughter had already graduated at the time of the promise, father is not obligated. Daughter incurred no legal detriment to support his promise. So in this example, when the father promises to the daughter, if you suffer the legal detriment of graduating, I will then suffer the legal detriment of paying you $10,000. But the daughter actually had graduated at the time of the promise. She had already suffered that legal detriment. So she cannot bargain in this example, in this promise, to get the $10,000. Instead, this example would show that the father is essentially giving a fake offer, right? Because she already did this. So it's essentially a gift in which the father wants to give the daughter $10,000. It's not a contract. So the second category in which consideration doesn't exist is when consideration is made in regard to a pre-existing legal duty. So a pre-existing legal duty is an existing duty imposed by law, or a person is already under contract to render a specified performance. So let's see this example. A contractor tells a homeowner that unless she pays him an extra $500, he will leave her roof half repaired. Because the contractor has a pre-existing duty to repair the entire roof, he has not incurred any new consideration. So in this case, the contractor and the homeowner already are in a contract for the contractor to render performance of fixing the homeowner's roof. In the midst of the performance, if the contractor says, unless you do give me more money, then I won't actually repair the other half. This is not valid because the contractor was already under a duty to repair the entire roof and may not use this promise as new consideration. And lastly, part payment of an undisputed or liquidated debt is not consideration for a promise by the creditor to accept the part payment in full satisfaction of the debt. A promise to pay part of a disputed or unliquidated debt is consideration for the creditor's forgiveness of the remainder, but the dispute must be in good faith. So simply this third category of items that are not sufficient for consideration are in the case of a debt that already has been undisputed. So it's essentially a loan that was already made and the creditor already essentially has proven that they are the ones that are the valid recipients of payment of the debt. In the case in which it's undisputed debt, then the promise of a creditor to a debtor saying, hey, if you pay me like 25% of what you owe, then you're fine and you don't owe me anything. That is not valid consideration. If, however, there is the debt in question is disputed, in which there's not one single creditor who legally is able to collect on the debt, but there's more than one creditor or purported creditors, then in that case in which there's more than one creditor, one of the creditors could ask the debtor saying, hey, if you pay me 25% of this debt, then I'll forgive the remainder. In that case, because the person promising to completely forgive the debt, it's not necessarily known if they are the one to actually get the debt. They're allowed to promise to drop their claim to the debt. So this is one of those smaller scenarios in which consideration is valid in the disputed debt case, but not valid in the undisputed debt case.